And so of course there's gonna be two distinct strategies to alleviate this asymmetry. And that is what I believe the Cain and Abel story tells us. Because you have a goal, there are things that needs resolving. And there are two distinct methods to go about this generally. Either you adjust the external realm, or you adjust the internal realm. Okay, so welcome to the third episode of this biblical series. Last episode, we explored the different type of strategies that you generally have in life when dealing with asymmetry, or like things that you don't like, I guess. As usual, I highly recommend you to watch that video first. But other than that, let's get right into it. So after establishing that the Cain pattern is aligned with, externalizing asymmetry, we explored that Cain, when faced with asymmetry, God didn't like him, Cain gave his offering, he expected God to like him, but he didn't. And so what did he do with that asymmetry? Well, he went out and killed Abel, right? And this is externalizing behavior. Yeah, if you look in the Bible, for example, you can follow the Cain descendants, right? You can see that Lamech, I think it's pronounced that way, told his wives, right? I can state right here, So, Adam and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech. Listen to my speech. This is Lamech speaking, a descendant of Cain, right? So, for I have killed a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. And if Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77fold. So Lamech basically tells his wife and brags to them that he killed a man for wounding him. This is a person that is happy with his decision to kill the man for wounding him. This shows that the city of Enoch, right, is riddled with violence. This is the Cain pattern. The ultimate symbol of externalizing your issues is, or like asymmetries, like things you don't like in reality, is to kill that thing off. So Lamech is a prime example of the descendant of Cain, which is to externalize. He even brags about it. He even feels good about it. And that's quite telling. And so you can see how the whole pattern of Cain follows the arc of externalizing behavior. This is symbolized with violence. Imagine that you have an agent that acts like Cain. If you scale that agent, it builds a city of violent people that everybody collectively just, when faced with asymmetry, they're just, killing people off, right? And this works. The city is stable, right? But it's not stable for long, and this is how we follow the narrative further. You can see that Noah comes in as a pure contrast to that, which comes from the Seth lineage. The Seth lineage, if you don't know, if you haven't read the Bible, is basically a replacement for Abel. It's the lineage that gets restarted to serve as Abel, because obviously Cain killed Abel. So Noah basically walks with God, and this is proven through the logic of the flood, which we're gonna continue with. When faced with prediction error, instead of adjusting yourself, you adjust the world. This is the easiest way to go about it. It's lower metabolic cost, right? But it has some consequences. And so the more agents you scale, right, of the Cain pattern, the more people that are within the city, the more pressure they are gonna collectively build upon the external realm. Then there comes a point when you can there is no entropy cushioning left in the external realm. And so it builds up and hits a maximum threshold. Because everything in reality, there's no pattern or no structure that we have ever seen that scales infinitely, right? The system basically acts as a self-organized criticality system. And this is the framework of the video that we're going to introduce, the mathematical framework. A famous example of self-organized criticality is the forest fire example. So the setup is this, right? You have a patch of forest that has limitation, right? There's a finite space for trees to occupy, right? And so you can see how it grows denser and denser. And if you let the forest just grow and grow and more and more and more, it tunes itself to criticality. Because the forest is so dense, you have packed the full capacity of it. And when a small perturbation happens, a lightning or whatever, it now burns the whole forest down. And this is what happened in the early 1900s when people got the ability to control forest fires. The first reaction of the people was to stop all the forest fires, like have a zero tolerance of forest fires. But what happened is that when you don't allow these small forest fires to happen, you build up this system. It builds up, it self-organizes to criticality. Self-organized criticality is a mathematical framework that sort of fits here quite well. Because you can imagine that when you scale the Kane pattern, it externalizes everything. And because nothing in reality scales infinitely, including the external realm, there will be a bounce back. And the bounce back is what you're trying to avoid by alleviating these small valves. So, for example, today in Spain here, the firemen have become very intelligent. They know this structural truth. So what they do is that they self-sacrifice the forest. That is, they intentionally set the forest on fire. Intentionally. And so what happens is that now, when the space, the capacity of the forest is never hitting the ultimate threshold, it never allows to organize to criticality. If you just look at the logic here, right? Imagine that the forest holds life, right? If the forest allows itself to grow to maximum capacity and a small perturbation makes it go completely out, then you will have a soft reset. But if you do, as people here in Spain, they self-sacrifice the forest, then you will have at least a 40% patch or whatever of the forest that supports life, right? Because it never comes this huge extinction event. So you can imagine that if I have like these stones, right? If I drop like one stone at a time, right, like this, it will eventually build up a pyramid or whatever, right? Or a pile. And so the system naturally only allows for one sand grain to occupy one space. So it builds up, right? It builds up a pile. And then if I allow it to build up, eventually this is a self-organized critical system because it builds up for every little grain of sand or pebble that I add to this pile. It builds up larger and larger, and eventually when I add the last pile, it will create a huge avalanche. And if I want to create a big, stable sand pile, then the optimal way would be me to self-sacrifice the pile. So you can see that I trigger a small avalanche here, I trigger a small avalanche there, and what happens when I self-sacrifice the sand pile that I have built, then I allow it to create a much more stable ground. And now when I add things to it, it's a larger entropy space. Some systems have more capacity, some have infinite, and that is like an equilibrium state. But then you have these systems that sort of organize to a critical state, and then when that happens, it has to alleviate or depressurize that capacity because it can no longer hold it. This is just a physical thing, right? It's really interesting because if you're familiar with Hero's Journey, basically the idea of facing the dragon voluntarily. And why this story shows up is because it is a structural thing. Or it seems to be that, at least. Because neuroscience tells us that when you voluntarily face the asymmetry, the chaos, the dragon, right? Then a whole different set of brain functions starts. What happens is that informationally, when you voluntarily face the asymmetry, you can choose to take a finer cut, right? But if you allow yourself to do the Kane pattern long enough and build all the systems around you to its maximum capacity, then the dragon will come and get you. The dragon will come and it will bite off as much as it needs to bite off of you. And you have no time to react, basically. And so intentionally facing the dragon is like a release valve. You can imagine that the hero's journey in this sense of the violent structure. When when there is a conflict, you approach that conflict with intention and with meaning, right? And then you resolve it in that controlled way. If you don't do that, you leave yourself open for the possibility of a large perpetual collapse or an argument that evolves into a war. This is the idea of creating a technology to release the aggression that is bound to happen in a controlled way, right? Instead of letting the war or the conflict just happen, we have a system of releasing that pressure. Either self-sacrificing the forest, so the forest doesn't build up the huge density that allows for an event of the flood. This is embedded in reality's logic, just like deeply, right? And it's interesting because it's everywhere, it's harder to define the boundaries, right? This is generally harder. Scale in different things is generally harder to encode in language because it shares less boundaries, right? I cannot contrast it as much because it's scale indifferent. If you read it from a systemic lens, it seems really compelling, honestly, at least from my view. I mean, again, comment section, bim bam boom, you know the deal. Like, this is just my intuition, let's build on it together. You can see that if you scale, again, the pattern of Cain, which is to externalize asymmetry, there comes a point that you can no longer maintain that behavior because you will reach a maximum capacity, and so it will force you to stop that action, right? It works in a really interesting way because the flood seems to only account for the Cain patterns. Because you can imagine, like, the logic follows something like this. If you externalize, whenever there is no more places to put your shit, right? Then you are forced to do internal division. And so you can see that all the people, all the agents that follow the Cain pattern gets pruned out immediately. This is the Noah's flood, I believe. Noah is able to surf the flood because he doesn't even concern himself with externalization. And so he is immune to the collapse. Because you can imagine that collapse happens because you have placed so much pressure on the external realm. If your strategy was never to externalize, then this problem doesn't matter to you. You're just like invincible. The reason why you have to stay modular is because reality shifts. Like reality is just infinite bounded systems that have different constraints. And when a constraint moves that you can't really see, it cascades down to the environment, and then the environment is forced to move, and then if you don't move with that environmental change, you will perish. And so you can imagine that if you're not able to look at the current environment and see and be modular, I mean, it's one thing to look and it's one thing to have the ability to look but not to act. This is the economical system, right? It's quite funny actually when I realized this. Like, so the treasury bonds, right? I mean, recently the US have increased the national debt limit or whatever. And what this means is that they are allowed to sell more treasuries to people. And so they are basically recruiting more power through people's trust of the dollar system, right? And so when they get more capital, they obviously have more maneuverability in the short term. But what happens is that now you have obligations, right? And when you have obligations, you are basically locking the system in the future. And so you can see that you are borrowing certainty from the future. So this is a Cain pattern. This is a Cain pattern. Instead of placing it in the external realm, you literally place the asymmetry in the temporal dimension, like in the future, right? This is how the system seems to be stabilizing. This is how the system kind of works. What happens is that, let's say the economical example that we have been exploring here. If you bind yourself through these obligations in the future, you can imagine that you bind yourself in obligations 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 100 years eventually. Then what will happen is that you become so static that when something new happens in reality, a new pressure or something that needs the system to maneuver away from, then you have already locked the system in a future state. And so you cannot no longer maneuver and avoid the issue that is new, right? And so you can see how the system becomes, the more you place on the Kane pattern, the more rigid you become. And the more rigid you become, the less maneuverability you have. And the less maneuverability you have, the less you can sort of dodge problems and whatever that needs attention in the future. I mean, the censors of the US system could probably be able to look at the problem in the future, but because they have locked themselves into future obligations, they don't even have the ability to act. And so it doesn't matter. Like, you can look all you want. If you're not able to act, then it's cooked. So yeah, the Kane pattern is extremely good at creating order if you can one-shot the prediction of the future, basically. If you cannot one-shot the prediction, if you can't predict what happens like just all throughout, then it's better to be more malleable, right? I mean, this is the Able pattern. The Able pattern allows, through Noah in this example, right, to be more modular. He self-sacrifices. I mean, you can imagine that when God told Noah that, oh, the whole world that Noah resided within before the flood, he had to accept, for him to listen to God, he had to accept that everything he knew was going to die. And if he were able to accept that, right? I mean, you can imagine that the current environment that you reside within are a part of you, right? And if you are willing to sacrifice that whole structure, you are doing internal realignment. Noah is able to surf the flood because he doesn't even concern himself with externalization. So yeah, hope you enjoy this video, and yeah, I guess I'll see you next Sunday, hopefully. Thanks for watching, and again, comment section, any insight, any expansion, any corrections, let's do it.